Hi everyone, Leo's here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode, and I have Ben with me to talk to me about all the cool things that are coming with Arc-enabled SQL Server. Play the music. Hi everyone, Leo's here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode, and I'm excited to have Ben with me again. Ben, you're becoming a regular. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very good. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. I know that you came out of vacation, and I know that I was on the MVP Summit, and we were waiting to see when we can have this cool episode. Before we get into the weeds, as always, Ben, who you are, what is it that you do?
My name is Ben. I'm from Nuremberg, Germany. I'm a data platform MVP. I mainly focus on the, even still, on-prem side of the house when it comes to data warehousing analytics. More and more cloud coming, but we Germans, we're notoriously slow when it comes to cloud adoption. So a lot of still traditional SQL servers. So Arc-enabled SQL Server kind of bridges that gap between my cloud passion and my, I'm going to say, slow adopting customers and friends.
Well, Ben, like I mentioned, you're regular on the show. I think it's your third time on the show.
It is the third time it is.
Yeah, in the past, we talked about Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. You did the cool stuff with the Stream Deck from Elgato. You also talked to me about Arc-enabled SQL Server. And today we're continuing because Arc-enabled SQL Server, is kind of taking a bit of a shift, when it comes to the priority, when it comes to, the new features that are getting rolled out into the platform. And today we're here to talk about that, right, Ben?
Correct.
Yeah.
And
So
I think one of the big difference between Arc-enabled SQL Server and what we talked about before is that when we talked about Arc-enabled data service, we had all these Kubernetes and everything, whereas Arc-enabled SQL Server, that's really there for everyone. So it immediately reaches a huge broader audience, as you're going to see in a sec.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's all the SQL Server basically footprint that you have on premises that you can get into Azure using Azure Arc. Okay, so Ben, as always, I know that you have some cool things to show me. So what are we going to talk about today?
So we're going to talk about Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. And to get an Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, you're going to need an Azure Arc-enabled server. So that's kind of the baseline. So that means you're going to need a Windows or a Linux server that you run the onboarding agent on. In addition to that, you run something called the SQL Server Instance Discovery. So once your server is Arc-enabled, you can apply an extension which will just scan for SQL Server instances. You could say, well, you only want a specific instance or all of them or any that does not have GDPR in its name, yada, yada, anything like that. And while it's not a must-have, ideally, you also add the monitoring extension to that. What that gives you is a bunch of pretty cool features. Well, first of all, through that monitoring, you get that central looking glass, that central control plane. Let's say system center in the cloud. I'm not sure if that is something people like to hear or not, but I think for those that are not super familiar with what Arc is, especially when it comes to Arc-enabled SQL, I think it is a very good comparison for them to get a good idea of what that does. It gives you advanced data security. So you get Defender for your on-prem SQL server, as you would get it for your Azure SQL DB. You get the SQL assessment, the best practice assessment. So anything, if you're running Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL MI, any kind of SQL flavor in the cloud, you get these fancy assessments that tell you, hey, use this kind of disk. Hey, you didn't run CheckDB in forever. Hey, that database has never been backed up. You get all of that, again, for your on-prem SQL instances as well, or for that matter, in any other cloud as well. It doesn't have to be on-prem. So for anything that is not in Azure. And if you have SQL 2022, it even gives you Azure AD authentication against your on-prem boxes.
Yeah.
And again, the cool thing is Azure AD authentication, all that might even be super helpful if you're only running one single SQL server, but think of the power that you get if you're running a bunch of instances.
Yeah. And most likely, we talked about this, like most likely that, this is a product or, a platform that is not designed for one single SQL server. Obviously the estate that is out there is pretty big when it comes to SQL Server. And I think that, and you touched on a few important things here, Ben, and this is, for those who've been in the space of Azure Arc-enabled whatever, and also Azure Arc-enabled Server specifically, and Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, I think this combination of things is becoming more and more obvious, especially if you're looking at Azure Arc-enabled servers, right? Which the most popular extensions for Azure Arc-enabled servers is Monitor and Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And definitely, we definitely start seeing that also for Arc-enabled SQL Server because the matching there is just natural.
Just getting I want to get an overview of all my boxes that by mistake have been changed from the high performance plan to energy saving mode. And that's why all my ETL packages are running so slow and all of that. Using one single KQL query.
Yeah. Okay.
It's pretty cool stuff. I know you love slides, so I've prepared 50 more, but I'm bored of slides, so I'm actually going to jump into a quick demo here.
Oh, that's a shame.
We're going to enjoy that a bit more.
All right. All right.
Let me fire up a quick page on the portal. So basically all I'm doing here is I'm going to the portal. And in the portal, when I'm creating a resource, I'm searching for Arc SQL. That gives me my SQL Server Azure Arc. And to Arc enable a SQL Server, all you need to do is run a script on that box. And again, it can be a Linux box or a Windows box. So like with any other Azure resource, you start with I want to create that thing. I'm going to skip all that, yada, yada. Okay, what's my resource group? What's my region? What's my operating system? That region is important because that's where your metadata resides. So if you're Arc enabling your SQL Server, it is nothing amongst the things like MI-link or so where any actual data moves over. But still, with GDPR, your instance name or your database name might have customer names in it that cannot move outside of a certain region. So it is still important.
Yeah.
The operating system is important because that will define if I'm going to get a PowerShell or a Bash script. So let's say we're going to stick with Windows. Am I using a proxy? Is there anything else I need? What kind of license am I using? Because I could also use that to get hybrid license. So let's say I have an traditional on-prem license. I'm using the paid option. Could exclude a couple of instances if necessary. I'm only running one instance anyway.
Yeah.
Could provide my tags as always in Azure. So I could organize them by saying, okay, this specific instance is sitting in this specific data center, or it is running on this specific rack. It is for this specific cost center. All the fancy things you can do with tags. And all that gives me is this PowerShell script, which I could now download or already have downloaded. If I'd want to, I could also use a service principal to run it. By default, it will be an interactive sign-on, and that will obviously depend if you're running SQL Server on 5 or 10 boxes, just use the interactive login. If you're running SQL Server on 100 boxes, you may want to do that unattended because otherwise it's going to take you quite a while. I already ran that script. Basically, all that script does is it does everything for you. It downloads the agent to Arc enable your server. It will then check, hey, is your server already Arc enabled? If not, it will Arc enable the server first. So while I said the prerequisite is for the server to be Arc enabled, you do not have to manually do that before. And once it does that, it will install the Azure extension for SQL Server, meaning it will do that instance discovery. Then that script it takes about 5 minutes, so it's not that big of a deal, but we will need to do a lot of chit chat to get over that, which is why I ran it before.
And Ben, for those who are new to this space, or for those of you that kind of drifted and now want to come back to look at the new things that are happening, one thing that is noticeable, I mean, there are a lot of things that we added for Arc-enabled SQL Server, but one thing that I really like is this breaking of dependency when it comes to Arc-enabled Server, meaning that the automatic onboarding as Azure Arc-enabled Server as part of the automation or as part of the script. That's something that we added, I want to say recently, relatively speaking. And that's definitely something that that is a major improvement and a lot of feedback that we got from customers. So yeah.
I totally agree, because that really means all you need is one account that has permission to create. It will, even if you say, I want to have this in the resource group XYZ and that resource group doesn't exist yet, it will create it. It will create everything for you. So that takes a lot of the pressure and boundaries that you had before when people were deploying this, because you had to think of this, you had to think of that. Yes, it would tell you, but then you always had to take like 2 steps back. So this is super smooth. Basically, you hit F5 and you're done. And once all that has ran through, we can take a look into our resource group that has been created for us. And like I said, I ran this before. Let me just order this by my resource types. I have my Win server, which is the one that I'm connected here to, which is my Arc-enabled server. I could go there. I could check memory consumption, all that. Let's not care about that. Let's only look at the SQL side of the house, because it gave me a bunch of additional resources as well. The SQL Server Azure. Think of that. You have a SQL Server on an Azure VM. That would also give you 2 resources, because you would see your Azure VM and it will give you the SQL Server SQL Server resource. And this is the exact same thing that we're seeing here. It created a resource for all my databases on that server. And since I enabled the best practice assessment, it also created a data collection endpoint and rule for that. We're going to take a look at that in a second. So let's take a look at our SQL Server here. On that plane, what you see is, okay, cool. I see my databases. So there's my AdventureWorks, which is online. That's my size. That's my compat level. Is it read-only? Does it have auto shrink enabled? All these things.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Also, I could go to my overview where it will tell me this is my SQL Server version and all that. So I'm in Developer Edition, SQL Server 2022.
Yeah, the metadata. Yeah.
My properties, that is not the super fan. It is nice to have because, again, with this, I could immediately run a query, show me all the SQL servers in my estate that are below a certain patch level or something like that. But I could enable auto patching, which kind of relates to what I just said for Windows and SQL Server updates. But let's take a look at anything we've seen until now. That's kind of stuff that we already had with other tools.
Yeah.
This is where we're really getting the cloud and the on-prem flavor mixed together. So I have my best practice assessment, and it's scheduled to run at 2 a.m. every Friday, but it also ran 2 manual steps here. And if this would fail, it completed for me. One of the typical things that I tend to forget in the beginning, not this time apparently, is the account running SQL Server needs to have access to my databases. And if you do a next installation, for example, it would not.
Yeah.
Don't do next installations. Let's start at that. And again, you get these same insights that you would get from an Azure SQL DB. So, okay, there's a bunch of new issues, but there's also resolved issues. Like here, for example. Hang on. Let's click that one again. As previously mentioned, my VM was not on the high-performance power plan. I did not run CheckDB on a couple of DBs for a while, but there's also other issues like no backups have been taken, etc. And then you can decide what you're going to do with that. And I'm only looking at my one specific instance here, so I'll just take that portal view. All of that ends up in a log analytics workspace. So again, I want to get the big picture across my entire estate. No problem. Use some KQL queries rather than going through all the individual best practice results.
And Ben, you touched on a very important point at the beginning before you started showing the best practices assessment. You said that this is really where this whole notion of on-premises and cloud mix is coming true. And best practices assessment, again, is something that is relatively new. I mean, we rolled this out a few months back. I mean, nothing to So, and the thing that I like about best practices assessment is that when we're saying Azure Arc and we're saying control plane and we're saying projecting resources, at the end of the day, you don't do that just for the sake of Arc enabling a server. There is,
Exactly.
Arc is really a lot of the time when I would, talking to folks like yourself and obviously a lot of other people, I always said that it's just a vessel. It's a vessel to do other things, either get intelligence or have some sort of a fleet management capabilities for certain things. And also remediation. And I think the best practices assessment is really that tipping point when it comes to Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, when we're going from the world of, hey, it's nice, metadata, fleet management kind of thing, into a world that is a bit more remediation-oriented.
Exactly.
Would you agree?
Totally. And again, this is anything we've seen up to that point is like, yeah, we've kind of had that before. I could have run a bunch of PowerShell scripts. I could have used System Center, as mentioned before. I could have used other tools just for inventory. This is where I'm now really getting stuff that I did not have before in that way. And I'm actually getting cloud capability almost rolled back to the on-prem box. I mean, the assessment is actually running in the cloud, but that capability has not been here before in that way. At least not that easy. I'm pretty sure there's other tools and all that out there that would give me some of that information, but not as easy as that, scheduled without me taking care of basically anything.
Okay.
And then one more thing I want to show you before we get there. Let me jump back to my resource group here. One other resource that I've created is a key vault. And in that key vault, I've created 2 access policies, one for my on-prem server itself and one for my Azure AD user, for my SQL app.
Okay.
To allow them to read and get keys, to list permission secrets and all that. And what exactly these permissions are, it's all in the docs. So but the important piece of information here is you need a key vault to do what I'm going to do next. And in theory, you could, the wizard create that key vault for you, but I like maintaining a bit of control of what's happening here.
Yeah.
So I'm on the Azure Active Directory pane here on my Arc-enabled SQL Server, and I can now say set admin, search for my SQL user, my SQL admin, and that could be any Azure AD user in my Azure Active Directory. So going to provide my key vault. I'm going to let the service manage its own cert. I'm going to let the service take care of the app registration. So there's a bunch of things happening in the background. Like I said, I like taking care of some of my stuff happening here. So I want to have my own key vault and everything. I don't necessarily want to take care of certs. I trust Microsoft to take care of that for me. I could even use something called Purview Access Policy. So I could use Azure Purview against my on-prem environment.
Yeah.
Let me save this here. So what this will do is it will now create that certificate and the application, et cetera, and basically have my on-prem SQL Server registered within that key vault against that Arc SQL resource, and that will allow me to authenticate against my on-prem SQL Server using Azure AD, including all the different flavors, MFA and all that, against my local environment. So think of that shop that may have, hey, I have a bunch of SQL servers on-prem, I have a bunch of SQL servers in the Google Cloud, a bunch of SQL servers in AWS, and a bunch of SQL servers in Azure, or a bunch of SQL flavors in Azure. You can now use one single account against all of them, because you can now use Azure AD against all of them, rather than, oh, they use their own domain, they do this, they do that.
Which is also like key vault integrated, like because of the integration AAD, key vault, like these are things that are very like, let's put things in the right perspective here, like what you are describing here, because doing something like this, like before the Arc universe, right? Before these type of integrations, when you have like this on-premises environment, obviously you wouldn't be able to Arc-enable SQL Server. But here's the thing, like in this universe that is just on premises, creating an integration for that. And again, you're just showing a single server, but when you look at an entire state of SQL servers, right? Again, in the before world, you wouldn't be able to do that easily, because you had to create, something compared to Key Vault, like, CyberArk or some sort of a vault that you had to have on premises, then have that certificate management mechanism inside the vault that attached to a single user account on premises in Active Directory, and then you had to sync on-premises Active Directory to Azure AD. Like, this is, again, it's just
that sounds super easy and practicable.
Right. That sounds like a breeze, right?
Everyone could do that, right? I mean,
everyone can do that on a Monday.
It's only 17,000 clicks.
Yeah. So, and I just wanted to put things in the right perspective. Like what you just described is, just like that. But honestly, if you're thinking about that in an on-premises universe, that's not easy. That's not easy.
Nah. So I'm going to go to my application that has been created here for me. And in the API permissions for that, what I need to do is I'm going to grant admin consent for that, meaning this application actually can interact with my Graph API and all the other stuff happening within my Active Directory, within my Azure Active Directory. This done, I can now go here to my on-prem SQL box. I can use Windows authentication still. None of that has changed. But I can also connect to the same box using Azure Active Directory Universal with MFA, for example. Oh, hang on. And use my SQL admin. Of course, trusting my server certificate.
I'm actually happy that you got that error.
I'm not.
Well, it's kind of showed the sausage making, which I like.
So where I can now sign in using my password. And
Nice.
depending on whatever Azure AD decides to do, it may ask me for MFA, it may not, depending on how that account is actually set up.
Yeah.
So I'm now connected against my on-prem box here using Azure AD authentication. I could add additional Azure AD users, I could add additional Azure AD groups, but it's not exclusive. I can still use my local on-prem domain users and SQL users if I wanted to.
Very cool. Ben, I like talking to you because you always bring me demos that are on point in the sense of the specific integrations that mean something to people. It's not about the fluff. It's not about just the nerd knobs. It's also about real integration, especially the one at the end, with the Active Directory and what we talked about, like what that process would have looked like in the on-premises universe. So thank you for that.
If it had been possible at all.
I mean, it's not easy. It's not easy or impossible, like you mentioned. Yeah.
One thing that I really like about this, I mean, you remember me talking about how slow we are with adopting to the cloud. The Azure AD part, that is only SQL Server 2022. All the other stuff that we've seen also works for the previous SQL Server versions. So even if you have not migrated to 2022 yet, which I understand some people have not yet, you may not get that very last feature, but that best practice assessment, for example, you get that for all of your old SQL servers. And it might even help you getting that migration done because it might surface issues that you hadn't seen before. So pretty cool stuff.
I always said that, Azure Arc a lot of the time is kind of a foot in the door, an intermediate step, sometimes for migration process. If you look at the large migration projects, right? One of the key challenges that you see with this type of project is that you don't have visibility to the environment in a way that really matters. Sure, you might have some visibility, but a lot of the time you don't, especially for organizations that are not really mature in their IT operations or very lightweight IT operations and need something that will compensate for that. And these type of integrations that we're offering with Azure Arc really provide that lens. So I'm happy that you touched on that, Ben. As always, thank you so much for joining me, my friend. It was again a real pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine. Looking forward to the 4th episode together, huh?
Yes, definitely. I'm excited to see what you're going to bring me next time. And for the Jumpstart audience, thank you so much for watching. Again, like, subscribe, because why not? And we're going to see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.